Okay. Well, we seem to have reached a steady number in terms of participants. So I'm going to kick us off because we have a lot of great discussions ahead for today. So good morning, good afternoon to everyone that's joining us today. My name is Stephanie Michaud, and I'm President and CEO of BioCanRx. BioCanRx is a national not-for-profit that invests in the development of immunotherapies so that we can bring these to patients across Canada via clinical trials. Before we begin with today's session, we want to acknowledge that BioCanRx is situated on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. We acknowledge and respect our traditional hosts and thank them for allowing us to operate on this land. It is also important to recognize that we're gathering virtually. And so I encourage all of those that are joining us online to learn more about the traditional land that they are on by going to whos.land, which is a website. So we're really pleased that you're able to join us today for BioCanRx's virtual public forum. This is an event that takes place annually to coincide with our Summit for Cancer Immunotherapy. Our summit, we're very fortunate, is going to be taking place in person this year in Montreal, and it brings together scientists from Canada and doctors also from Canada and really around the world to come and discuss and share the results and discuss these new directions that we're going to be speaking about today with respect to cancer immunotherapy. It also brings together patients and patient partners, also other not-for-profits and cancer charities that are interested in this kind of dialogue and seeing how they themselves can become involved in research and contribute to research by being a partner in the research itself. So this year's topic for our public forum is cancer immunotherapies, new therapies on the horizon and future patient access. We're very fortunate. Dr. John Bell is going to be discussing with us and informing us on what is new, what is coming up on the horizon, very similar to those discussions that are going to be taking place at our annual conference. He will be joined by Dr. Rebecca Auer, both of which will be introduced a little bit later, who is a clinician scientist right here in Ottawa at the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute. So this year's public forum is very much focused on those new therapies and how these can be accessed. And when we're using the term access, we're not referring to access in the way that a patient is able to access medicines when they're prescribed by his doctor, for example, like chemotherapy or another product for the treatment of their cancer. We're talking about access via clinical trials. And why we have chosen this topic for this year's public forum is the following. Research in the development of immunotherapies is moving forward at a very rapid pace. And so to be able to benefit from the latest research that's taking place, it's very important to be able to engage in the development of those new inventions that are found in laboratories, and then to bring them forward as clinical trials. And so part of the conversation today is going to be about clinical trials and accessing clinical trials right here in Canada to some of those innovative new cancer immunotherapies. So before we get started, I would like to express my gratitude to our sponsor, Merck. We're very, very grateful that Merck has chosen to sponsor today's session. Secondly, a few housekeeping notes. If you would like to ask a question, please add it in the chat box. We have multiple individuals from BioCanRx that are monitoring the chat box. The forum is going to be recorded, and we're going to post it on BioCanRx's YouTube channel, and we'll also share a link in the chat box to a survey that we hope you will fill out after the forum, and this link will be emailed to you. Now, unfortunately, today, I regret to inform you that we will not be joined by Dr. Louise Binder. I've just recently found out, as she has an honorary doctorate in laws. And unfortunately, she is not able to be with us today. So I will be filling in for Louise, though definitely not filling her shoes, but muddling through. And also joined by David McMullen. And so I would like to introduce you to our co-moderator, David McMullen, who is here on this call. So David is a professional engineer working 37 years with Ontario Power Generation, and he's held various management, engineering, plant maintenance, and business planning roles in large electrical power stations. In 2012, David was diagnosed with multiple myeloma, an incurable hematologic cancer. Since then, David has had 2 stem cell transplants and a variety of other treatments, including participation in a phase 1 clinical trial. Since his diagnosis, he has become very active with Myeloma Canada, a very successful patient-based charitable organization in various patient support, education, advocacy, research, awareness, and fundraising activities. He's also active on several myeloma patient support groups in Southern Ontario, including his role as longtime chair of the Toronto and District Multiple Myeloma Support Group. He's the founding chair of the Nationwide Myeloma Canada Patient Advisory Council, where he was an ex officio member of the board of directors. Since 2015, he's been an active patient representative in the Cancer Clinical Trials Group, or CCTG, in the Hematology Disease Site Committee, and previously in the Quality of Life Committee and Melanoma Disease Site Committee. David is also a member of the CADTH Patient and Community Advisory Committee. As can be seen from the bio that I've just read out, David has a very strong interest in treatment, research, and feels privileged to know how many hundreds of myeloma patients across Canada. Over to you, David.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. And today we are so fortunate to have a patient partner on our panel who is a very amazing advocate, and she has participated in a life-saving clinical trial. We have a surgical oncologist and clinical trial doctor and a scientist who will speak about immunotherapy, cancer research, and treatments for the future. Both these doctors are amazing and world-renowned researchers. So again, we are so fortunate to have them join us. We have 4 themes for today's panel. These include what's new and on the horizon for cancer immunotherapy? How does cancer immunotherapy treatment available in Canada rank against other countries? This is something that we as patients are really quite curious about. Barriers for cancer research, getting basic science to clinical trials, and the need to help government pinpoint actions and approvals needed to focus their efforts and dollars, our dollars, by the way. The last theme is, what are the barriers and how can we improve Canadian patient access to cancer immunotherapy and treatments and clinical trials? So again, as a reminder, this presentation is meant to be accessible, and we welcome all your questions throughout the event. Please use the chat. So Stephanie, over to you.
Thanks so much, David. I have the unique pleasure of introducing our audience to Stéphanie Dupont, a patient advocate and clinical trial participant. Stéphanie Dupont is an aspiring teacher living in Montreal, Quebec. She possesses a bachelor's degree in international development from the University of Ottawa and has experience working with several not-for-profit organizations. In 2017, after relapsing a second time from B-cell acute lymphoblastic leukemia, she traveled to Philadelphia to take part in a CAR T-cell immunotherapy clinical trial. She has been in remission ever since. Starting in 2018, she became a patient consultant and advocate for immunotherapy, notably advising researchers at the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute on the patient experience through the development of a Canadian-led CAR T-cell therapy trial. Stephanie, why don't we start with an introduction I know I've spoken a little bit here, but perhaps you can tell our audience a little bit about yourself and your experience with cancer.
Yes. Hi everyone. My name is Stephanie, and I do live in Montreal currently, but I'm originally from Ottawa, Gatineau region. So as Stephanie mentioned, I was diagnosed for the first time as a teenager. So I was 13 at the time, and my diagnosis was acute lymphoblastic leukemia, B-cell. And I went through the pediatric normal treatment at the time, which takes 2.5 years, and it worked. So after that, I was 5 years in remission and was able to lead a very normal, healthy life. When I turned 20, though, I relapsed, and I received shortly after a bone marrow transplant. I was lucky, and my brother was able to be the donor for that. Unfortunately, 1.5 years later, I did relapse again. And at that point, the situation was a bit more challenging and scary, because I had no idea what could possibly be done at this point, because I thought we had gone through all of the treatments possible. But my doctor did mention that there were opportunities in the US to participate in clinical trials that would use my body's own immunity to fight the cancer. So she was very adamant to send me to the US, and that's what happened.
Okay, that's incredible, an incredible story. So clinical trials, for those in the audience who may not be aware of the term, this is a highly regulated process where a novel therapy, a new therapy, is evaluated to see if it works. It is first checked to make sure that it is safe and does not cause any serious side effects. Once it passes that hurdle, then we go to the next stage, where a larger group of patients are enrolled, and we look at what is called efficacy, whether or not the drug is working. And then if positive results are obtained there, we can then move on to even larger trials, where we try to establish how well it is working relative to other therapies that are currently in existence. CAR-T is quite unique, since the results are quite astounding relative to what is available, specifically in certain patients. So how did you find out about the trial in Philadelphia, and what made you participate to decide, after this very difficult road, to participate in this out of country trial, where you had to leave Canada and go to Philadelphia?
Yeah, so as I said, I really didn't know that there was anything else that left to do for my illness. But my doctor, Dr. Nat Shakekri, at the time, was very confident that I would be able to go to the United States. And at first, she didn't mention Philadelphia. It was Bethesda at the National Institute of Health. So after some paperwork and administrative technicalities, I was sent to Bethesda with my family to undergo testing to see if the trial was fit for me. And it turned out, after many different rounds of testing, that it wasn't. But luckily, the scientists over there did have connections in Philadelphia. Those connections would not have happened without this step of the NIH, because Dr. Kecker wasn't, as close with the people in Philadelphia. But I was sent to Philadelphia to meet with these doctors, and they gave me a spot on their waiting list for the clinical trial. So the only caveat with this was that I had to wait to get access to the treatment. So I had to come back to Ottawa and wait several months before being able to start the trial in Philadelphia. As for why I decided to participate, for me, it was a bit of a no-brainer, you know. My survival was at stake, so anything that could be done, I was ready to do, and my family was too.
Absolutely, absolutely. So you've mentioned going back to Canada and having to wait several months. Would you be able to elaborate on, you know, the barriers, the challenges that you encountered while participating in this trial, or even, you know, waiting for this trial?
Yes, so as I mentioned before, my leukemia was of an acute genre. So the disease does progress quite rapidly. And at this point, I had already received both the pediatric standard treatment for leukemia and also a bone marrow transplant. So the toxicity of chemotherapy and radiotherapy at this point for me was very high. So if I received just a little bit more, it could completely throw me off the edge. And that's what happened. We had to keep the leukemia in check, but we couldn't keep just giving me micro doses of chemo. At some point, we had to up the dose a little bit. And then I got very ill. I was hospitalized. And in the hospital, I contracted pneumonia. I contracted pneumonia with no functional immune system to fight it, which led to almost a worst case scenario. I was sent to the ICU, intensive care. I was put on a ventilator, and for 2 weeks, I was breathing through a ventilator. Along this, my body completely gave up. My muscles became atrophied, and I had to relearn everything by myself after that. I had to learn to walk, I had to learn to breathe and eat, etc. So it was almost like being born again after this ventilator came out. So I was in a very, very weakened state, and everyone around me was quite scared at this point. But miraculously, to this day, I'm not sure how, but I did make it through this, trying time. And I was able to slowly get strength back to be able to travel to the United States. However, ever since this experience, my lung hasn't been the same, and there are permanent scars there that, have been giving me more vulnerability to certain kind of bugs, and I will speak to that later, but it's left its mark on my body. As for the trial itself, during the trial, it was more about being isolated from a community of people that cared about me back in Canada, at home. So I did travel with both my parents, and we stayed together throughout this time. But, also as a 22-year-old, being 24/7 with your parents is not ideal, It was difficult. So those were the main challenges of being in Philadelphia. It's like having advanced cancer like this is mired with uncertainty already, but this additional stress or toll of being away from what you know, if it could be prevented, it would be best. So it was an additional challenge for sure. But I want to also stress that despite this, the actual process of going through this clinical trial for me, even though I was really over the whole cancer treatment thing, I just wanted to go home, but still, in retrospect, it was a much smoother experience than what I had before. And I am speaking to my experience. I know that CAR-T can have severe risk for some people, and even sometimes not work. But for me, it was smooth. And after a month, I was in remission. So that's why I'm advocating for it today, because I think it's just something that should be put we should put more emphasis on it so that one day maybe treatments that are so aggressive like chemotherapy and radiotherapy may, take a step back so we can have more targeted kind of treatments.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, Stephanie. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Those were incredible challenges that you overcame to get to the trial in Philadelphia. I feel like you've touched on this a little bit, but could this treatment experience have been improved for you and potentially other Canadian patients requiring this treatment in the future?
Yeah, well, for this question, I just want to, explain a bit how the fact that I had to wait 4 months before going to Philadelphia has affected my life. Because it has affected my life back in 2017 when I had to go through all of this process of healing from this severe pneumonia. But this year, it really did affect my quality of life because I've had not one but 2 infections in my lung, and I'm still being treated for it, and it's been extremely difficult. It's not cancer, but it's still, it's a big impact on my health, and it has prevented me from holding a job, and it's been just very taxing generally. So, and I'm still not sure how this will pan out, and if there's even a possibility that they have to take a part of the lung out because of all of this all these scars and vulnerability. So for me, you can't help but think back and be like, oh, if the situation had been as it is now, I could have had access to a treatment close to home. I could have avoided this wait and avoided all the complications that I ran into. Of course,
yeah, I know.
We can't change the past, but what I can do is to share my story and say how important it is that patients get the right treatment that they need close to home to promote their physical and mental well-being. So yes, all of that, not to mention, as I said, the stress of being away from, family members, friends. My brother wasn't there with me in Philadelphia. So it's an added stress, and that should also be ideally avoided.
Agreed. It's really important to have that support system around you. Thank you, Stéphanie, so much for sharing this with me. I really, really appreciate it, as I'm sure everybody who's listening to you does now too. David, over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Stephanie. And again, thank you for sharing your personal story. It's so meaningful to us. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce one of our very renowned scientists, Dr. John Bell. And as we mentioned, he is a world-renowned researcher, a thought leader in oncolytic virus research. Oncolytic viruses are viruses that infect cancer cells, and he's also involved in the development of this research. In addition to his many academic contributions to the field, Dr. Bell established a GMP manufacturing program. GMP is a standard for good manufacturing practices that has produced a clinical-grade oncolytic viruses for worldwide use in phase 1 and 2 clinical trials. Dr. Bell co-founded and was the chief scientific officer of Generex Biotherapeutics, which was acquired by Silogen. Dr. Bell also co-founded Turnstone LP, an enterprise linking 4 Canadian research institutes to drive the clinical and commercial development of a proprietary next-generation oncolytic vaccine platform. Dr. Bell is a senior scientist with the Ottawa Hospital and professor of medicine and biochemistry, microbiology, and immunology at the University of Ottawa. He heads the Canadian Oncolytic Virus Consortium a Terry Fox-funded group that is developing virus-based cancer therapeutics and is the director of the Biotherapeutics Program for the Ontario Institute for Cancer Research. He is the scientific director of BiocanRx, Canada's Immunotherapy Network, and a network of centers of excellence. Dr. Bell is also a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. So, Dr. Bell, we are really looking forward to your presentation.
Well, thanks very much, David, for that introduction. And thanks to Stephanie Dupont for really another, I've heard her speak many times now, and she's such an eloquent young woman and tells her story so well. It's very, very moving. So thanks, Stephanie, for doing that. What I'm going to speak about is some of the science behind treatment that Stephanie has been successfully treated with, a little bit of that, and really just sort of try to contextualize cancer a little bit and where, as David mentioned, I see the future going with terms of new kinds of therapies and treatments. So I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully this works. Let's see what happens. All right, so there, you can see that slide okay? So this first slide is just to remind me to speak a little bit about a few things that are, I think, important to know about cancer. Now, everyone on this video today knows about cancer, but I think there's some points that really need to be emphasized. One, of course, is it's a very bad disease for Canadians, and 85,000 Canadians will die this year of cancer, which is twice the number of people who died in the whole pandemic in Canada. And that number will continue on every single year. So we really are in the throes, and have been for some time, of a pandemic for cancer. And it's really impacting Canadian society in a tremendous way. Not only are these are people dying from this disease, but of course their families are terribly impacted by their illness. Their caregivers are impacted, and it's estimated about $25 billion a year it costs Canadian economy in terms of lost wages and treatment of patients and so on. So this is really a massive sociological problem that we really have to come to grips with. But I think another thing that's important to point is we have one word, cancer, to describe this disease. But the reality is it's not just one disease. It's not even just a cancer of a particular tissue like a breast cancer or a prostate cancer or colon cancer. We know now from studying it in great detail that cancer is a very complex disease, and each person's cancer is unique to their genetic information. So it's a very heterogeneous disease, and it's going to be hard to find a single pill that's going to be able to treat this disease, because everybody's cancer is just a little bit different. So that's one of the challenges that really faces scientists and clinicians as they have to deal with this particular disease. Now, right now, the mainstay for cancer treatment is, of course, chemotherapy. Let me just have to advance the slide here. And so if I told you I knew somebody who's undergoing chemotherapy, an image like this would come to your mind right away. And that's because we've now learned over the years that this has been used for such a long time to treat cancer, that there's a real problem with chemotherapy. As you heard from Stephanie, that the impact that's had on her whole well-being and so on was tremendous. And that was because the chemotherapy not only attacks the cancer, but unfortunately it also attacks your normal tissues. And so this picture here, an image of a woman going through breast cancer chemotherapy, and she's lost her hair. And worse than that, she probably has sores in her mouth and so on. It's because the chemotherapy is not just attacking the cancer like we want to. It unfortunately, as I said, also has side effects and attacks your normal tissues. And that's a real problem and a real limitation to our therapeutic approaches today. So what we really need to have, and I think Stephanie even spoke to this a little bit, we need to have cancer-targeted therapies that attack only the cancer and leave your normal tissues unaffected. That's really what the goal is of my lab and thousands of research labs around the world, is trying to find those kinds of therapies that will specifically attack the cancer and leave your normal tissues unaffected. So unlike chemotherapy, which unfortunately has these off-target effects, we want something that's really bang on, only attacks the cancer. And I think what's really interesting is this new class of therapies called self-replicating cancer therapeutics, that I'm going to speak about now. And these are therapies that have a really unique property in that they actually propagate themselves once they're inside the patient. And an example will be, as I'll speak about in a minute, is an engineered immune cell that will actually grow and attack the cancer. Another example is the idea of using viruses to infect, replicate within the cancer and destroy it, the so-called oncolytic viruses that David mentioned. And so why are these self-replicating cancer therapeutics so important to develop? Well, I just want to give you a very, very simple image to make you think about how these different kinds of therapies work. So if you have a cancer, let's suppose this is a patient who has a cancer in their abdomen, shown by that red ellipse there. Then if you want to actually get the appropriate dose of chemotherapy into that tumor, what you have to do is really add enough chemotherapy that it goes all throughout the body, and eventually you get enough in the tumor, but you also have that same amount of chemotherapy everywhere else in your body. So it's a real challenge. You're putting toxic chemicals not just in the tumor, but also throughout your normal tissues. And that's really one of the limits of chemotherapy, is it's not targeted to the cancer, and it's not very selective between cancer and normal cells. So this is really a problem that we've faced for 60 years or more with the current approaches. So on the other hand, if you have a replicating targeted therapeutic and you administer that to the patient, and the only place that it can actually grow is inside the cancer, well, then you're going to see that therapeutic produced right where it needs to be in the cancer, destroy it, and then that'll be the end of it. And the therapeutic will then just go away or resolve itself, and you won't have all this off-target effect. And that's really been our goal, and the goals, as I said, of many labs around the world, is to try to develop therapeutics that are like this. So really little biological machines that can source out where the tumor is and then grow in it and destroy that tumor. That's really what they're designed to do. And I think this is really the revolution that's happening now in the world, leading to these new kinds of therapies that can attack the cancer selectively. So I'm going to give you one example, which is the treatment that was used for Stephanie. This is a so-called CAR T cells. And so CAR is a short form for chimeric antigen receptor, which is just a word that we use to describe how we've modified these T cells. Now, T cells come from your thymus. That's why they're called T cells, from thymus. And T cells are immune cells that run around your body normally looking for infections like viruses or bacteria. But we can actually change them and make them so they can recognize something that we want them to recognize, in this case, a cancer. And the way that's done is that we harvest from the patient, and this is what happened to Stephanie. They in Philadelphia, is they isolated T cells from her. They then added in a particular kind of gene therapy virus called a lentivirus, which encodes this so-called CAR, or the chimeric antigen receptor, that is then put onto the T cells. And so when that happens, you now have a whole bunch of T cells that are growing in a test tube with a particular molecule on their surface that says to them, I want to bind to a cancer cell and destroy it. I know how to recognize a cancer cell, and I'll go get it. So these cells are then expanded in the test tube, and then they're infused back in the patient. And they're allowed to continue to grow, especially when they encounter the tumor. And when they see the tumor, it makes them expand themselves and grow even more. So that's what CAR therapy is. And just to give you a little visual, because I think visuals are really important. This little GIF here is sort of cool because I think it shows you exactly what happened inside Stephanie's body. So there would be cancer cells, these big white blobs that are floating around in her blood. And then these blue or purplish balls are actually T cells that have been engineered to express a particular antigen, which will show up right there, this chimeric antigen receptor. It recognizes something on the surface of the cancer cell, and together like a team, they just destroy that cell and get rid of it. So this really is how I think the future of cancer therapy is going to continue to evolve. We're getting closer and closer to being able to create these little engineered immune cells to go in and find the cancer and just destroy it and eliminate it. And once the cancer's gone, those cells have nothing else to do, and they just go back to sleep and just ride around your body waiting in case that cancer should reappear. And there's lots of different forms of how this can work. There's different ways that we're engineering, and the future, I believe, is very bright, because I think it's going to be a combination of therapies that are like this one, or other kinds of therapies where we include viruses or bacteria, actually it's now engineered bacteria that can grow only in tumor cells, and use these in combinations to really identify and destroy cancers in many different ways. And I just want to show one last slide about a young girl who, this young lady here, Emily, was treated, as you can see, about 6 years before our Stephanie. And she was the first pediatric patient to be treated with one of these CAR T therapies, and at the same place that Stephanie ended up going to in Philadelphia. And she was at really at end of life, had no other options available to her. And she was allowed to go on a phase 1 study, just like Stephanie Michaud was mentioning. It's really important to be able to access these studies, because it really is not just allowing us to test our ideas, but potentially have people have an opportunity to have a great outcome. And Emily had a great response to her therapy, just like our Stephanie did. And she now, as you can see in 2021, is doing extremely well. Has had a great life up to now. She's doing really, really well and disease-free, and has become a great advocate for this kind of therapy as well. So I think just these two young women, Stephanie Dupont and Emily Whitehead, are just two of the many patients who have now benefited from this kind of approach. And this is really only the very beginning of what I think we're going to see in the space as we continue to move forward and find new ways to treat the various forms of cancer through immunotherapy. So I think I'll just stop there.
John, thank you so much for a beautiful and most impactful presentation. If I may add statistics to your comment about how significant cancer is. Almost 1 in 2 Canadians will be diagnosed with cancer sometime during their lifetime. And of course, this doesn't just affect those patients, those people living with cancer. It affects their families, it affects their friends, it affects their workplaces. Essentially, it affects essentially all Canadians. So when we as patients advocate for more resources to be devoted to cancer, including cancer research, we're not just advocating for ourselves as current patients and our families. We are effectively advocating for all Canadians, because whether all of us know it or not, we will be impacted by cancer sometime in our lives. So next, we'll move on to our next presentation by Dr. Rebecca Auer. And again, we are so fortunate to have Dr. Auer with us. She's an amazing researcher, tremendously well published in research journals and other publications. She is an international leader in surgical oncology and translational research in surgery. She is the scientific director for the Cancer Therapeutics Program at the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute, surgical oncologist specializing in colorectal cancer surgery and retroperitoneal sarcomas at the Ottawa Hospital. And also a professor in the Department of Surgery and the Department of Biochemistry, Microbiology, and Immunology at the University of Ottawa. Dr. Auer holds a Tier 1 clinical research chair in perio-operative cancer therapeutics and leads a translational research program focused on understanding how to harness the immune system to prevent the development of metastatic disease following surgery. Perio-operative means it's relating to operations. So, Dr. Auer, we're really looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction and for the opportunity to present today. I'll just put the presentation mode on. If I can. Great. Well, thank you so much to John for introducing some of the concepts, and for Stephanie for talking about her experience, which resonates, I think, for many patients and families who've had the unfortunate experience of having to live through a cancer diagnosis in their family. I'm going to talk a little bit, reinforce a few of the concepts that were raised already this morning, and then talk about where we are in Canada in terms of immunotherapy and biotherapy specifically, and what are some of the opportunities and exciting new advances in Canada. So a lot of this we've already talked about. We know cancer is common and it's deadly. And unfortunately, when we delay cancer treatment, every month of delay really increases the mortality quite significantly. I think most of us know this fact that, from the time of the beginning of the pandemic, cancer's killed 4 times as many Canadians as COVID-19. So not to say that the pandemic hasn't been terrible, and of course those people that lost their lives to COVID-19 is devastating as well. But we have essentially an endemic disease with cancer, and we really need to focus on that. Cancer is costly too, and so we talk a lot about the costs of novel cancer treatments. They are expensive, but it's really a fraction of the cost of cancer as a diagnosis. And the combination of lost wages, out-of-pocket expenses that patients have to bear, and the loss of productivity among those cancer patients. And importantly, of the 26.1 billion, 30% is actually borne by the patient and their family. So really there's a devastation with cancer in a family, and there's also a financial toxicity that compounds that. This is a picture of a gentleman, Nobel Prize winner Paul Ehrlich, and he won the Nobel Prize in early 1900s for his work in immunology. And it really is the backbone for our concept of immunotherapy today. What I think is so amazing is that before the kind of microscopy we have now, before our understanding of receptors, like John showed you in his video, and binding, he had this idea, this concept, without any real visual interpretation of what that might look like, and was able to really understand the immune system that way. He also really coined the term the magic bullet, and essentially he was describing a concept that certain chemicals, in his case he was talking about chemicals, but molecules that could be designed to bind and to kill specific microbes or tumor cells. And actually his work in syphilis led to the discovery of the arsenic compound sulfarsartan, which actually was used for decades before the invention of penicillin. So over 100 years ago, this concept of a magic bullet was coined. I think it's important to remember where our origins of cancer therapy that are the backbone of cancer therapy now, where do they come from? So the main pillars of cancer therapy traditionally are surgery. You can see a picture here, surgeons around a patient, chemotherapy, so using chemicals to kill cancers, and radiotherapy. And for example, in the world of chemotherapy, really the father of chemotherapy is considered, this man here is considered almost the father of modern chemotherapy, a man by the name of Dusty Rhodes, or Cornelius Rhodes, and he was an American pathologist and oncologist, and the director of the Memorial Hospital, and subsequently the Sloan Kettering Cancer Research Institute. But interestingly, he was also the chief of medicine in the Chemical Weapons Division in the US Army. And most of their early days of research in chemotherapy came from chemical warfare. So really, these treatments were not designed to specifically target the cancer cell per se. They were based on the fact that cancer cells may grow a little bit faster, replicate a bit faster. And so if we can treat them with poison, and we can kill them off before we kill the host. And that, not to say that those workhorse treatments haven't been effective. There have been significant progress in cancer care since that time, from the Second World War till now, and that was in a number of decades was called the War on Cancer in the US. because it really was an all-out war on the cancer cells and tumor growth. But these cancer treatments really do have a negative effect on patients and their quality of life, and those effects can persist well beyond, as Stephanie, pointed out so personally, like well beyond a time when you're cancer-free. But this is kind of where we are now, really a fundamental explosion in our understanding of cancer cells. And I think to be able to realize this concept of a magic bullet, we had to understand cancer at a cellular level. And we had to understand our immune system and how the host interacts with cancer. And that was a long journey. That's a 7-decade or more journey. This picture in the bottom corner here of the cost per genome, remembering that the human genome took 13 years the first time it was sequenced and cost about $3 billion. And now you can pretty much sequence the human genome in about 48 hours, and it usually costs less than $5,000. So the pace of discovery, our ability to understand, manipulate biologic systems is incredible, and including our ability to then synthesize that data using artificial intelligence. So we're in an incredibly promising place in terms of our understanding of cancer biology and cancer in the immune system's interaction with cancer. And that's been seen in our therapeutic strategies. So here's just a picture of what they're called new molecules, essentially. This is an FDA, so this is an American graph. It looks kind of similar in Canada. And you can see that the slope of the curve starting in around 1995, 2000 has really increased, where we have all of these new molecules being approved. Many of them are biologics, so things like antibodies, and some of them are small molecules. And these really target very specific problems in cancer cells, and some of these are in the family of immunotherapy as well. So really this understanding of cancer biology has allowed us to translate this into targeted agents. There's really a fundamental difference between a lot of what's called targeted therapies, or those molecules that target specific defects in the cancer, and then immunotherapy, those molecules that tell our immune system, train our immune system, or engineer our immune system to go out and kill the cancer. And this is a picture of something called a survival curve. And here you have on the y-axis the number of patients alive. Up here at the top is 100%, down here at the bottom is 0. And then this is time on the x-axis. And the red line is sort of supposed to represent where we were with chemotherapy, surgery, and immunotherapy for some, chemotherapy, surgery, and radiation therapy. And for some cancers, when they've already spread beyond where you can surgically remove them, the majority of patients do die. And what you can see with targeted therapy is that the shape of the curve does change in that we shift it over so that patients have a longer time being alive. But unfortunately, what we see is that the tumor develops resistance to those therapies in most cases, and the survival curve ends at the same place. What's really striking about immunotherapy, it's been noted, is that it's changed the tail of the curve. And here what we see is these patients like Stephanie Dupont, are actually cured. When their immune system decides or is trained or engineered to kill that cancer cell, it will kill that cancer cell. And every time a new one pops up, it will kill it again. Now, of course, it doesn't work for everyone, as you can see here. But each time we understand how it's working, it gives us a bit more information. And we've seen survival curves in melanoma like this that have increased like this, and then they're like this. Each time we understand something more about that cancer and its interaction with the immune system. The immunotherapy is one of the newest platforms against cancer, and it consists of cell therapeutics, viral therapeutics, which Dr. Bell spoke briefly about, and synthetic antibodies, and sometimes, and the ones that are in the clinic now are often called checkpoint inhibitors that kind of turn off the brakes on your immune system and allow the immune system then to kill the cancer. And again, they don't work for every cancer, they don't work for every patient, but we're increasingly understanding why they work and when they work. So Dr. Bell already told you a little bit about CAR T-cell therapy, so I won't go into detail, but all that to say, you can see that it's a fairly complex thing. It's not just shipping a pill from where it was manufactured in, let's say, New York City, and giving it to a patient, or an IV bag, a vial, and mixing it in an IV bag and putting it in the arm. So these are fairly complicated, and they can in some cases be, you know, fairly expensive to develop. But again, modestly expensive compared to the financial toxicity of not having an effective cure for cancer, or having a cure for cancer that leaves one with significant debilitating side effects. This is called the translational valley of death. It was coined in 2008. And essentially on this side of the curve, we have the scientist with the novel therapy. On this side of the curve, we have the patient and the doctor who are trying to get that therapy. And this is where most of our therapies die. And particularly in those more complicated immunotherapies, where you need an infrastructure to be able to translate that that interesting discovery from the lab to the patient, but it requires patient material, and it's a personalized therapy. So patients need to be basically at the site of manufacturing, or the cells need to be at the site of manufacturing to be able to deliver it. And the problem with this valley of death is not just that this patient doesn't get the therapy that they need, but it's also that this scientist doesn't have the opportunity to then understand more about their therapy, make it better, build on that, and make the next generation and the generation that follows that of improved therapies. So there's a real loss if you don't have this bridge working. So what's the Canadian context? We actually have some incredible opportunities. So we have leading scientists in immunology and biotherapy. And we actually have a relatively good funding of that in that preclinical space, although of course it could always be better. We actually have very collaborative and highly effective national clinical trials organizations. We can deliver on clinical trials, and we can do so across the country. Not just at the high volume academic centers, but everywhere. And although it's sometimes a challenge, the publicly funded healthcare system can be an advantage. But again, I think we have to embrace the concept of research as part of care. And that, I think, is one of our challenges. There are these really opaque and arbitrary lines between funding for research and clinical care. We have clinical care funding, but somehow, if anything enters into the space of research, that care isn't funded anymore by the same stream. And I'll show you an example of how problematic that can sometimes be. We just have we have had in the past a lack of translational support in moving again across this translational valley of death in manufacturing and clinical trials. And our Canadian infrastructure really is somewhat underutilized in that arena. I'll give you an example. CAR-T, which we just talked about, is a really good example. So CAR-T products were approved first in September 2018, and then I think February 2019, 2 companies had a CAR-T cell product, and they were approved by Health Canada in September 2018. And at that time, we'd only had, so I'll just tell you that approval was based on a single phase 2 single-arm study demonstrating that 54% of patients had complete clinical response. That means cancer was gone. So there was a time, I think, when you needed 1,000 patients to detect a 10 or 15% improvement. But that's because we didn't understand what the specific mechanisms, we didn't have that magic bullet. But when you do have a magic bullet, you don't need 1,000 patients in 10 years to find out if something worked. You can do a phase 2 study, and when it works in 50% of the patients, you haven't fixed everything. There's work to be done, but it means that doesn't require a phase 3 or a larger study. But at that time in Canada, only 2 clinical trials of CAR-T had been undertaken in Canada, both at Princess Margaret in Toronto. And so there was really only 1 Canadian center and a handful of clinicians and nurses that had any experience with this novel therapy that was now Health Canada approved, We'd never manufactured a CAR T-cell product in Canada. And yet we had all these research teams across the country who were already developing next generation CAR T vectors. So we had the scientific expertise, but we didn't have the clinical or manufacturing expertise. And so this is really a biotherapy translational problem where, in Canada, we have, again, a relatively well-funded cancer research ecosystem. And we do have world-leading scientists, as I mentioned, in technology and immunotherapy, practice-changing trials, and yet we aren't translating these novel biotherapeutics across that bridge. A few, I think, important stats. There's 707 cancer immunotherapy clinical trials. Sorry, that number is wrong. It's 70 cancer immunotherapy clinical trials were initiated in Canada, and of these, 30 or now I'm getting it wrong. So 707 cancer immunotherapy clinical trials initiated. Of these, 30 were based on Canadian innovations, and half of those trials were actually attributed to BioCanRx. So I think BioCanRx has really been at the forefront of moving Canadian innovations into the Canadian clinical trial ecosystem. So where we're doing all right in cancer immunotherapy clinical trials, we need to get our own inventions into Canadian patients. And we need to get more than just the therapeutic synthetic antibodies into patients. We need to be able to deliver on the cell therapies as well. So as most of you, I think, know, BioCanRx is a network of scientists, clinicians, cancer stakeholders, NGOs, and industrial partners really working together to bring these therapies from the bench to the clinic, to be able to accelerate Canadian promising discoveries, and also to offer really improved treatment options and quality of life to our Canadian patients. And I think no matter what discoveries we make, if we can't get those discoveries into the mouths and arms of Canadians, we're not actually making the progress that we should be in this country. And this is, again, BioCan's mission to accelerate from bench to bedside, and that includes projects that are at the sort of development phase, novel ideas, new CAR T candidate molecules, enabling studies which help to allow them to understanding how to manufacture them and create a product that we can give to patients. And then, of course, the foundational clinical trials, which gives our patients access earlier to novel therapies, but also gives our scientists an opportunity to translate their discoveries to patients, and our clinicians an opportunity to understand how these therapies are actually going to work and learn in the clinical trial space how to manage any side effects and how to care for these patients. And there has been significant prioritization towards Maine and Canada solutions for research and development, and that's included a significant investment in biomanufacturing capacity. And part of that, I think, was highlighted during the COVID-19 pandemic, when it was clear that we didn't have the biomanufacturing infrastructure we needed for vaccine development. But this includes investments of $1 billion to advance industrial research and development, both in vaccines and pharmaceuticals in this space. And this includes things like $126 million in the National Research Council new biologics manufacturing center. And that's in addition to the $44 million upgrade to the NRC's existing Royal Mount facility to establish biomanufacturing for vaccine trials. So I think there's been a recognition of this lack of capacity, and that, I think, has been an important flag that that Canada has begun to address. There's also been the launch of a countrywide biomanufacturing consultation, recognizing the need to build this out, and emphasizing the importance in sustainability, training, upskilling workers in that space, and our ability to have economic growth in that space, and being prepared for other pandemics, as well as addressing the endemic problem of cancer. And these are other investments in various different companies and public-private partnerships that again have had important impact on biomanufacturing capacity and investments in Canada. Our capacity in Canada currently is not what it needs to be, but it's certainly improving. And I think BioCanRx has had a huge footprint in bringing a lot of these biomanufacturing centers together. And you can see that by and large, except for the maritime provinces, we have some representation for biomanufacturing across the country. And one of the things that BioCanRx has really focused on is something called a point of care network in Canada. So we know, for example, CAR T-cell therapy, which is really just one cell therapy platform, and there are going to be others come into their own maturity and Health Canada approval in the future for sure. And again, we largely don't have this technology in Canada, but thanks to BioCanRx. And even though Health Canada has approved the use of CAR T, it's actually very difficult to access it in Canada. So some provinces don't have a funding model and you have to travel out of province. And of course that can be challenging as well. Some even need to be sent to the United States with a pretty huge price tag, much higher than if we developed this on our own. And so the need to create a Canadian research platform is really obvious to BioCanRx and to the patient partners to be able to have patients access this type of therapy in Canada and close to home, to allow clinicians and scientists in those centers to develop expertise and an understanding of how these therapies work and how they're delivered. And so this is why BioCan has, tried to network facilities to allow point of care manufacturing for CAR T, but again, as a platform for biomanufacturing for any other cell-based therapeutic that is going to be the next kid on the block, so that we don't get caught standing still the next time a therapy is clearly a successful winner and a game changer for cancer patients. And so here's just an example of some of the networked centers where manufacturing of these and other products are possible. These centers can share best practices, training, expertise, technology to be able to continue to enhance and improve. BioCanRx has also started an integrated training program to support this biomanufacturing ecosystem, because we need to have people who understand how to manufacture these products, and it's a very high skill. And I think during the pandemic, the strained capacity already for this type of highly qualified person became even more obvious. So this is a partnership with MyTax as well as the University of Ottawa and Algonquin College to give trainees an opportunity to become ready for a job. And I understand that 100% of those who've graduated have been successfully employed in that field. But lastly, I'd just say that I think we need to blur the lines between clinical research and clinical care. And I don't mean that from an ethics point of view or, an oversight point of view, but I think I mean it from a funding point of view. So this is an example of a patient, and not dissimilar from Stephanie's story, but she was a bit older, 36-year-old mother. Because she was a bit older, she wasn't eligible for the Health Canada approved CAR T product, and yet very likely would work. Fortunately, BioCanRx did have a clinical trial of a made in Canada CAR T cell, which she was able to access. And after a number of years of treatment and pretty significant side effects from those treatments, she is now, because of CAR T, because of the ability to join that trial in CAR T, she is actually disease-free and now able to raise her daughter and re-enter the workforce. Yes, it's research. She was part of a research study, but it's also clinical care. And we can't just say because something's approved, we stop studying it, nor can we say because something's not approved that we can't find a way to fund it through our clinical care pipeline. So I think we need to think a little bit about why the lines are so opaque and impassable in our government structure. BioCanRx is an important collaborative among all sorts of patient groups, from trainees, scientists and doctors, government organizations, industry, patient groups, not-for-profits. It takes all of these people to really advocate for moving biotherapeutics to a higher place in the care delivery system and the clinical evaluation in Canada. And these are a number of patient groups and members that BioCan has worked closely with, and I think critically important to be able to move this agenda forward. And I would say from Christopher Reeve, once you choose hope, anything is possible. And I think clinical trials, particularly in the biotherapy space, they provide a lot of hope. And the patients who participate in them are very courageous to do so. I think as Canadians, we need to be a bit more audacious. We need to know that we can cure cancer. We need to believe that, and now we need to go and do it.
Okay. Dr. Rebecca, thank you so very much for your excellent and very informative and encouraging presentation. Clearly, there's a lot more work to do, and we as patients are so humbly grateful for the work that you and your fellow researchers are doing ultimately to benefit us. Now we have a few questions for the panel, starting, Stephanie, with you.
There you go. I was on mute. So thank you so very much, David. And thank you so much, Rebecca, for that excellent presentation. It was fantastic. We actually have questions in the chat, and one for you, Rebecca, and also one for Dr. Bell. The first is to you, Rebecca, and it's about where we are at with respect to the publicly funded healthcare system. And the question is, do public healthcare funds fund the $500,000 CAR T therapy? And then on that same theme is a second question from another individual that's listening in. Is CAR T treatment offered in every province at this time? So over to you.
So the industry standard for patients who meet the criteria, and it's a fairly limited criteria for CAR T, but they are funded to receive the therapy. And it is not provided in every province, but there are I understand that there are agreements between provinces so that patients in a province for which this isn't provided can then travel to another province and receive that care. Before we had that ability, patients were sometimes sent down to the US, and that was a price tag of about $500,000. I don't know what the price tag is for CAR T in the various provinces now. I'm not sure if that information is even known, although I know that Canada as a rule negotiates together for the best price tag, but I can tell you it's much more expensive than what a CAR T product that could be delivered through Canadian manufacturing facilities would provide.
Thank you, Rebecca. There is David, do you mind if I ask John the question with respect to replication?
Oh, sure.
John, there's a question for you in the chat, and it goes as follows. Could self-replicating cancer therapeutics be used in forms of vaccines for non-cancer patients to act as preventive medicine, or is the future of the research more focused on treatment of diagnosed patients?
That's a really good question. And I think the reality is it's probably moving in parallel paths. And as we find more and more things that can predict if a cancer might occur, then we can begin to develop preventive types therapies. Right now, the focus, of course, is largely on people who already have cancer. But for sure, I could very easily imagine scenarios where one could create a therapeutic and have it be administered at the very onset of a cancer, or even before that, in order to keep a cancer from arising. So one clear example of something like that is the HPV vaccine. We know the human papillomavirus causes some kinds of cancers. For sure, it's well known, it's well documented. There's no question about that. And there's now a vaccine available that you can get, and you should probably have all your children should all be vaccinated with it if possible. Because if you prevent infection by HPV, you can eliminate cancers like cervical cancer and many kinds of cancer of the throat and other parts of the body. So those things are happening because, as Rebecca mentioned, our ability to really sequence the human genome and understand diseases at the molecular level provides us with new ways to approach these problems. And so, well, now, as I said, the focus is on people who have cancer. I can totally see how our knowledge that increases exponentially will allow us to be able to anticipate cancers and prevent them with these various kinds of biological therapies.
Thank you so much, John.
Yes, Stephanie, if I may, we've got a question here from Jan Blugel. And it is my understanding is that CAR T therapy has been quite effective treating ALL and various forms of lymphoma. However, it has not been as effective for multiple myeloma. Is this still the case? And if so, why? Is there a technical issue that makes myeloma more difficult to treat? Is it because other cancers are more common and therefore have gotten more attention? So I'm thinking either of the doctor researchers, maybe Dr. Rebecca, if we could start with you.
Oh, you muted, Rebecca.
You're muted.
Sorry about that. No, it's an excellent question, and I texted after I saw the question our real CAR T expert, Dr. Natasha Kekri, who is the PI of the CLICO-1 trial, and is unfortunately on well, not unfortunately for her, but unfortunately for me, is on maternity leave, because I know she would be able to answer this question really well. As a surgeon, I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. I thought that there was some CAR T therapies that were being investigated for multiple myeloma as well, some engineered T-cell engineered TCR therapies, which are a slightly different type of cell-based immunotherapy, which have had some early promise. But John may know more, so we'll see.
Yeah, there clearly are CAR Ts being developed for multiple myeloma, and they haven't been exactly the home run that we've seen to some extent with the kinds of leukemia that unfortunately Stephanie originally contracted, but they are working to some extent. And I think the honest answer to this is that we need to do more research to understand why in some malignancies they work really well and others not so well. Because once we understand that difference, we can tune them and make them better. But for sure, there are trials ongoing now with CAR T products that can attack some forms of myeloma. And I think it's really doing more trials, understanding better how they work so that we can improve them. Maybe you have to add a little twist to it. Maybe you change the antigen you attack. And I think that's really where we are right now. So I would predict that in the near future, we'll see much more effective therapies for myeloma. There certainly is a lot of people who have this disease, and we are trying to put an effort towards finding a cure for that one as well.
Well, John, thank you so much for your encouraging comments. As a myeloma patient myself, there are currently 2 CAR T therapies that have been approved in the United States, and they are presently being used, very expensive and very limited manufacturing capability. One of these has been approved by Health Canada, but has been recommended by CADTH for not reimbursement because the clinical benefits are not clear enough to warrant the cost. The remission period is so far is much less than it is for ALL or some lymphomas. But thank you as a patient for working on this. Stephanie, do you see any other good questions here from the chat?
Yes, I do actually, and it's from an organization that you know very well, David, Myeloma Canada. So most Canadian lead research and trials are funded by CIHR. There is a lot of competition for the limited dollars available to invest in research. CAR T trials is competing with cardiovascular trials and other therapeutic areas. Here's the question: how can we increase the research dollars in cancer immunotherapy?
I think we just need to call Justin Trudeau and say, give us a little bit more money. I'm sure he'll do it. I mean, the problem is, as a Canadian society, we have not prioritized science. I mean, it's not just anyone's person. It's in Canada in general. You know, the number that Rebecca mentioned, about $26 billion it costs us for cancer every year. And yet the amount we put in, and I think, Stephanie, correct me, I think it's 500 million a year we put into cancer, all forms of cancer. Yeah. So it costs us 26 billion, and we're only willing to put in about 2% of that number into finding results. And I think what I find incredibly frustrating is that we start to see these tremendous outcomes, like Canada's Stephanie Dupont and Camille Leahy, and yet we don't use that to invigorate ourselves and say, okay, let's really push on this now and put the foot on the gas pedal. So we do need to have more resources from our government and from our citizens towards this, and prioritize research, because it's clearly the answer. It's clearly something that it's going to boost our economy. But I think the reality is there just is not enough going around right now to cover all the aspects, and yet there could never have been a better time than this to invest in research. So it's a real frustrating from that perspective, I have to say.
And John, if I may add to that, as a patient, we in Canada, you know, fortunately, we live in a representative democracy, and politicians will listen to those who advocate. But if there's somebody over here advocating for, you know, better roads, better education, or whatever, all perhaps worthy causes, then some of the funding that might go to cancer research would go to these other causes. And as you pointed out, John, in your presentation, and I mentioned, cancer is something that's going to affect essentially everybody in this country. So we need to advocate for more treatments, better treatments, and more research. Thank you, researchers again, into that will benefit us, current and future cancer patients in Canada.
I would also say maybe again, blurring this line between what's care and what's research, I think has a role to play. There's this for instance, we now have, Biocan has a made in Canada CD19 CAR, which has has been demonstrated efficacious in a clinical trial, and yet we will still pay a company, tenfold the amount of money for their product instead of investing in this, pipeline and infrastructure. Now, maybe that will change, and I know Biocan is advocating for that type of pipeline, but we need to move from clinical trials into from that research space right into clinical care. There needs to be a continuum there, as opposed to just shut down A and then try and figure how to build B from scratch. We need to, I think we need to pull those two concepts closer together.
Hear, hear. I think you'll find a lot of folks that are listening in to be in violent agreement, Rebecca.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Rebecca, I think this one is for you. This is in the Q&A. What is the best way to go about investigating how to take part in an immunotherapy clinical trial?
That's a really good question. I think obviously we say the first thing to do is talk to your doctor, your oncologist, and see what they have available. Now, they may not know of trials outside their own institution or outside of their own sort of clinical trials office. So to move beyond that, it can be a bit challenging, but again, a lot of those patient support groups and patient partner societies that Biocan partners with will have a resource for clinical trials in that disease site. And you can also contact the Canadian Cancer Society. They also list trials that are available in Canada. And then it's a bit more challenging, but you can go to clinicaltrials.gov and type in your disease site and something like immunotherapy or CAR-T or T-cell therapy, and you'll get a list, and you can group that by country and see what's available, for example, in Canada or North America in general. So those are some options. I don't know, Stephanie Michaud or Stephanie Dupont, if you have other suggestions for patients.
Stephanie, I don't know if
Well,
you're,
the only thing I would say is ask your doctor, because and I think you outlined already a few options. I couldn't add more to that.
yeah, I would say it's so the resource that's offered by CCS, so Canadian Cancer Society, where there is somebody who will answer the phone and spend time and carry out those searches for you with respect to your specific indication and identify those and send that to you so that you can initiate a conversation with your medical doctor, your medical oncologist. Another fantastic resource are patient groups. BioCanRx has, is incredibly lucky to work with, our Cancer Stakeholder Alliance, which is, brings together well over 50 different patient groups. The amount of knowledge, experience, expertise with respect to how to navigate, the healthcare system, but how to identify specific types of support, the research, their knowledge about the research that's taking place, et cetera, is incomparable. So I would encourage that would be a really important resource for individuals to reach out as well.
Just a general question, and both of the presenters, well, all three, including Stephanie, touched on this. But I wonder if we could elaborate a little more on the barriers in Canada to immunotherapy research and trials. And second to that, what perhaps can we do specifically to pinpoint opportunities to our officials, elected or otherwise, to overcome those barriers? So open to anybody. I know, John, you've already spoken to this. Is there anything more you could elaborate on that?
Well, I think that Rebecca has been for some time now raising the concept that and she did today as well, that we have to stop seeing these as two solitudes, clinical trials and research are separate things. In fact, and patient care, they're all part of the continuum. It used to be, and I think Rebecca showed some graphs about this, that our changes in discovery were only causing incremental changes in patient outcome, if at best. But now we're seeing these changes that are very dramatic. We're seeing that tail, that curve come up, as Rebecca says. So I think we have to start saying, hey, you know what? Patient care involves more than just the same old stuff we already have. It involves these new ideas, this new research that's happening. And I think if we could start to blend them, or as Rebecca said, blur those lines a bit better, it's going to really help overall, because patients will benefit, especially Canadian patients who are not benefiting now because we don't have so many of these trials here. And scientists will benefit because we'll learn so much from each patient that we'll be able to go back and make it better. And I think overall, and clinicians, of course, can benefit because they can offer things to their patients, which right now they don't have options to offer them many times. So I think that's a clear way that we could very easily and allow us to reallocate some money towards things that need to happen. And I think, another point that I think is important for us to think about is trying to move some of these therapies up earlier in the patient's disease. So rather than make Stephanie Dupont suffer as she did through all these layers of treatment, which were not going to be effective, move it up forward in her treatment so she can get access right away to these kinds of therapies. And I think that's it's a psychological thing that I think as a country we have to get ourselves accustomed to.
Okay, Stephanie or Rebecca, do you have any additional thoughts there?
No, I agree with everything that John has stated, moving forward as part of our strategic plan. This is, utilizing these types of advanced therapies sooner. It is part of our mandate. It's something that we wish to be able to see. There have been some absolutely outstanding results that have been reported. These are clinical trial results coming out of the United States, which show what can happen when immunotherapies are used, for example, in colorectal cancer patients, before they undergo other types of treatment. And the results have been absolutely astonishing. And I'm sure everybody here have heard about them. These folks had no evidence of disease, and I'm not aware whether, what their status is at this time, but it was a really a really important result that showed that if we can do things earlier, perhaps we can have different outcomes, and perhaps we can migrate away from you know, the more harsher treatments that we currently have.
Okay. And a general question I would seek from the researchers, and Stephanie Dupont, you might have some thoughts as well. What can we do as patients to improve your research?
And to have more clinical trials.
I've used that in a broad sense, you know, patients, families, or members of the community, because again, as I mentioned, you know, at some point we'll all be patients or families of cancer patients. So I'm sorry, Stephanie, you mentioned more, advocate for more clinical trials.
And more clinical trials. What can we do for more research and more clinical
Yes.
trials in immunotherapy in Canada? Yeah.
Yep.
I'm just picking up on one of the questions that came up in the chat, where people are asking, what can we do? We want more of this. What can we do?
Yes. Okay. Well, I can certainly sign up to that. I've benefited by 2 clinical trials, and I may be going into another one. I am so humbly grateful that I had that opportunity. I wish there were more opportunities available for more patients.
Thank you, David.
I would just say, like, I think we need to tell the stories. It's great that Stephanie can tell her story. We need to tell those stories, because I'm not sure that everyone understands how different cancer care is today than it was 2 decades ago, or even 1 decade ago. And, you know, a cancer diagnosis is devastating, but it comes with a lot more hope today than it did, you know, a decade ago. And tomorrow the hope will be even more. And I think as Canadians, and I use the word audacious for a reason, I don't think we're audacious. I don't think we're like the Americans. We don't sometimes believe in our own ability to cure this disease. And yet we have, you know, BioCan has proven that's possible. So now we don't want to do it with 50 patients. We want to do it with 500 and then 500,000.
Yeah, you know, I would just, I'm not sure that I can give advice for what patients should do exactly, except to be engaged as Stephanie has been. I think that's clear, but I just want to say to them that we're so thankful that patients are engaged, because, you know, it's only through studying how these treatments do and do not work sometimes with patients that we're able. So I'm really pleased that people are brave enough to volunteer to be on these trials and test some of these ideas. It's incredibly important. But then also, you know, going out to the Terry Fox run, you know, that's something that, you know, my family does every year. Those sorts of things are just as valuable. And I think we really appreciate all the support that we get. And I would just encourage patients to, you know, grab onto the reins. Maybe it's being audacious, is what Rebecca's saying, to grab on the reins and do what you can to help yourself through advocating for yourself and making sure your doc is listening to you and knows you really want to try something new. I think that's really an important thing to do for your personally, and it helps everybody.
Yes, John. Well, thank you. One suggestion I would have, and this is for clinicians, and Dr. Rebecca, you are a fantastic example, but I think there's an opportunity for clinicians to increase awareness of clinical trial opportunities for patients. I know you're all tremendously busy. I really honor you. You got a lot on your plate, but this would benefit you know, patients. It would benefit medical research in Canada, which again will, in many ways, so many ways, benefit patients and their families in the future.
Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. Folks, we're a little bit past time, and I want to sincerely thank all of the attendees and all of your fantastic questions today. Of course, I wish to thank our panelists, Dr. John Bell and Dr. Rebecca Auer, in addition to my co-moderator, David McMullen. It's been a pleasure, you know, filling in for Louise today and being part of this discussion with you. So thank you all very, very much. As a reminder, the session will be posted on the BioCanRx YouTube channel We also invite you to take a moment to fill out the survey so we can get your feedback and make next year even better. The link's in the chat, and it's also going to be emailed today. And for those of you that are asking how you can get involved, contact BioCanRx. We work directly with a number of different patient groups and individual patients that are wishing to get engaged, right, in the kind of research that we do. So don't be shy. We'd love to hear from you. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.